I'm now going to be showing you a feature in Vue that Vue itself does try to prevent you from using, but it is fully functional, and that is normal maps on the rock objects within Vue. First, what I'm going to do is load in one of the rock templates or one of the rock objects. I'm going to use the red rock ridge. We'll go ahead and scale that up, make it a little larger. In the render, I do want to be able to see a little more of the ambient light, so I'm going to open up the atmosphere editor, go to the light tab, and just increase the sky dome lighting gain 0.5. We can also turn up the gamma, double click on the main camera view, and I'm just going to turn on my gamma correction. I've got mine set to 2.1 right now. Maybe go ahead and set that down to 1.8. Now, one of the things that takes the longest to render with these rocks is really the bump map channel, along with the highlight channel. So being able to use normal maps instead is desired, because it'll use an image map to create the bump mapping effect, or at least the procedural bump mapping effect. Now I think I'm actually going to start with just a reset material. So I'm going to go to the aspect tab in the upper right, right-click on the material for the rock, reset it. And we'll go ahead and just take a look at a quick render, what it looks like with no normal mapping or any bump map color, anything applied. So what we're looking at right now is just the geometry. And if we double click on the object, we can see how many polygons there are. There are about 29,000. We're going to go to edit the material, and now under the bump tab, if we were to apply a normal map, the typical way would be to import a normal map. Vue is going to tell us that it has no UV coordinates, so it can't do this. Well, that's not entirely true. Although it can't assign the normal map through the import normal map function, or even importing a material with normal mapping applied, it won't show up. But if we set it up manually, it will work. So what we need to do is edit the function. Control click on the material preview, or right click, go to edit function, and we need to set up just a couple of nodes. What we want to do is add in a texture map node, and we also want to add in a math node. So I'm going to right click, go to math node, go to vector operations, and add the RGB to normal, and connect that to our texture map. I'm going to right click once again, go to add output node, and select the normal mapping. So we can connect this to the RGB to normal, and now we can load in a texture map, a normal texture map. And I do have some normal maps set up here, and what we can do is from the Explorer just drag and drop that into the texture window. Now since we're using a gamma control, I do want to just close this out really quick, which we already do have the normal applied. Go to the main camera view, select the gamma correction options, and make sure that the texture map is set to 1, output of 1. Now if you're working with a scene where you do have the gamma set to different values, and you want to keep the gamma on everything else correct, what we can do is go into the image gamma, the Y icon that shows up next to the image, and override the gamma to 1. That will also work. Now, one thing I want to note is once we have normal mapping set up and applied, and we do see that in the bump tab, the normal map is showing up, or it says normal map, but we cannot edit the function through the bump channel anymore. So within the bump tab, the only really useful feature when this is connected is going to be the normal map amplitude, which will allow us to change the intensity of the normal map. And I wouldn't pay too much attention to the preview at this point because it will show a lot less of an output for the object than the actual render. So if we need to get into the function, we can go into the color tab and edit the color function in order to access the node. So this is a render of the current setup with the normal map applied to the rock. And our mode is set to the automatic and modes for the different mapping types. And this is going to cause seams to show up in certain areas of the rock. Even though we do have, in this case, a seamless texture, it will still generate certain seams unless we use a spherical map in a spherical mapping mode for this texture. In most cases, it's really not going to be something you're going to see. Especially if you have smaller rocks throughout the scene. If we go ahead and change our mapping mode to an object parametric mode and change our mapping mode, so the position mode to object parametric and our mapping mode, in this case the automatic and the automatic UV are going to be basically the same, with the exception that the automatic UV should prevent scaling of the map, the texture map, when the overall scaling of the material is changed. In this case, it might still scale it because there is no actual UV map. I'll go ahead and take a look. It does look like it is going to change with it. Normally, the UV mapping mode is the only way to really prevent the scaling. In previous versions of Vue, there used to be an unscaled UV coordinate, and that's been removed. And now we have to rely on the UV mapping mode. So if you want to make modifications to the overall scale of the texture, you will need to kind of compensate with the texture map. Now, the only way to really remove the seams on the texture is to use a spherical mapping mode. Of course, then you also have to have a spherical texture. In this case, this texture map is not set up for spherical mode. It does add a little bit of distortion, and I am going to need to set up some image interpolation as well. So what I want to do is set the interpolation type to bilinear, and we can also change the scale, kind of wrap this around a little bit more, maybe set the X 2.5. But there's going to be a bit of distortion with the spherical map because this isn't a sphere. It does have some areas that go outside of where the origin is, but it really is the only way to set up something that is going to have no seams around some of those edges. So for maybe something that's a little bit closer to the camera, a little larger, that might be what you need to do, is use a spherical map for this. But we can use faces and the automatic mode to create some very interesting rock normals otherwise. But like I said, there will be, in some cases, spheres or seams that do show up in some of those areas, but they might not be very noticeable. To decrease the intensity of the normal map, we can use, within the bump tab, the normal map amplitude. Go ahead and bring that down to 60%, and that will reduce it. Another technique I like to use for reduction close this out, go into the function, And what we can do is add a blender combiner node, set it to add, and what we're going to do is add in the input node normal options, and we can set that to object or world. I'm going to keep it on world. And we can add those two together, so the actual normal plus the texture map. And that's another way of reducing the normal in a different way. And it does provide a different type of intensity. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove those. I did have the intensity reduced, so actually I do want to show you that with the intensity set to 100 as well. So I'll just reset this up to add and re-render. So it does look a little bit different. And we do have a sort of a full intensity normal, but basically the Z, or the initial intensity of the normal and the placement of it, has changed. So it does somewhat modify the look of it. Now, most of the time, we're not going to be rendering the rocks that large. I'm going to go ahead and delete those extra connections for reducing the normal. The current texture map I'm using is 512 by 512 pixels, and that's actually pretty high, considering if we were to take all the an ecosystem scene and have different rock normals set up for the different variations, that would be a lot of texture maps that aren't necessarily needed if you're going to be rendering rocks from farther away. I'm going to go ahead and just rotate the camera a little bit and take a look at this from a different view. Now I found that you can get away pretty easily with a texture map that's 64 pixels by 64 pixels, and then just kind of repeat it. So set up a seamless texture normal. And we can just reduce the X and Y to 0.5. Of course, that's with a material scale of 1. And we don't need to render this so large. Now what we can also do is, you can go into the texture map, in the links tab, right click, and we could downsample it to a lower resolution. We divide it by 8 right now. Go ahead and render. It still looks pretty good. I am going to go ahead and replace that texture map with a lower res one. I've got one here that I rendered, created in Vue. That's 128 by 128 pixels, so quite a bit smaller. Change the interpolation mode bilinear, set it to parametric, and I'm going to go ahead and set this to faces. So we still get a lot of definition on it. One thing you may notice, depending on the mapping mode you're using and the rock, is sometimes the normals do tend to flip about halfway through the texture, where on the left side we have the normal going inward, where we're creating sort of dents in it, and then in the front here it looks more like they're bulging outward. It's not necessarily the direction of the color of the normal within the texture map, just kind of the way that this works in this method. More than likely it's because we're using faces, which is going to apply the texture map in different directions. So if we go back to the automatic mode, we could also set this down to 0.25 for the XY scale. Render that out. And it might be a little more consistent with the direction of the normal. So that works pretty good for farther away. Since most of the time you'll have an ecosystem of rocks, and you're not going to be rendering that close. And here's another render where I've reduced the scale of the texture to 0.5 by 0.5 instead of 0.25. And it works pretty well for this rock. Provided our interpolation type is set to something other than none, we can also downsample this, halve the resolution to 64 by 64, and it should still look pretty good. There's really no noticeable change between the 128 version and the 64. So you can get away with smaller normal maps, and I did save these as PNG format. They are also 16-bit images, so that you can get a little more detail out of them. Another potential problem you can run into when using normal maps on objects that view will state cannot accept normals and will not display them is how we transfer and save these materials to apply them to other objects. So I've included the scene. It's rock underscore normal maps underscore 02. We could just take a look at a render. It's just kind of the somewhat dented normal with a little bit of a color variation added to it. And since it has normal mapping set up, what we're going to do is add in another rock. I'll just do the mountain rock. Click OK. Go ahead and we can scale this up. Now, I want to apply one of the textures with the normal map, basically the texture that's, or the material that's set up on this other rock, the red rock ridge, and apply it to this other one. So if I was to go from the aspect tab or opening the material summary, drag and drop onto the other object, it's going to give us the same error we would get if we were to try to import a normal map onto the object, and it's just not going to work. So the reason this is happening is it's detecting that there is a connection to the normal mapping output. Now, simply just disconnecting it for the meantime and then transferring it over will remove this part of the function. It will remove the texture maps and the setup for that. So what we need to do is set up a temporary link to a different vector output in order to preserve these texture maps and preserve the setup for the normal map, and then reapply it later. And the easiest way to do that is just to add an output node of the origin and connect our texture map to that. So if we were to render right now, we wouldn't see the normal mapping showing up on this object. You also see once we start rendering the other rock, that bump takes a lot longer to render than a normal map does. But now that we don't have a connection to the normal mapping output, we could save this material and still preserve that normal map. We just have to edit the material and set it up after it's applied. So now I can drag this material over to the mountain rock, and if we go back and edit the material, we can see that the normal mapping output is still there. We just need to connect it to that texture map. And then we'll also have to go back to the other object that we brought it from in this case and reconnect those. So this is really the only way to apply the normal map in that fashion. If we were to save the normal map out, or save the material with the normal map out and try to apply it to any other object.